ago was one of three major non-violent mass movements that Gandhi led against British imperialism. And during the first of these three movements, which started 100 years ago, Gandhi defined freedom or Swaraj as he said, when we become free, we should think of freedom as a bed upheld by four sturdy posts. And these posts that would uphold the institution of freedom, a free and democratic India, would be non-violence, the abolition of untouchability, Hindu-Muslim harmony, and spinning. And of course, spinning had a particular resonance in the Gandhian worldview. It implied breaking down the boundaries between mental and manual labor, so the upper caste people who normally did not do manual labor span. Spinning was also important to generate local industry, and spinning was a sense of solidarity. Every member of the national movement span, as distinct, a form of solidarity distinct from fascist solidarity, where every fascist marched in shorts. So that was the kind of role spinning played in Gandhi's worldview. So non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, the abolition of caste and social distinctions, and spinning, the breakdown of elite hierarchies and prejudices. So that was his vision of Swaraj. And we're now 100 years on, 70 odd years since independence. And I think Gandhi would have been not horrified, but certainly depressed by where India is today.
Because India is a particular problem. You've called it the world's most unnatural nation, I think. It's not a nation, it's a conglomeration. How would you describe the India that arises in 1948 when it liberates itself from Britain?
So, of course, it's an India, the land that we occupy, it's an ancient civilization. So there are pilgrim routes, there are old myths that bind the people, there are philosophical traditions, but a nation in the modern sense did not exist till actually 1950, which is when the first constitution was formed. What Gandhi and other nationalists like he did, of course, I'm the biographer of Gandhi, but one must never forget that Gandhi was part of a movement that encapsulated dozens of extraordinary people, men and women from different parts of India, upper caste, low caste, Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, Christian, Sikh, Jain, who all struggled for independence from Britain. And in this struggle, you see the British artificially united India. When the British came, India was many different territories. They united it for their own instrumental and exploitative purposes. But the freedom movement gave the people of this territory a shared purpose. We'll create a society that is unifying, that is inclusive, that will not privilege a particular religion or a particular language, where the traditional forms of discrimination, which ran principally along two axes, caste and gender, will be overcome, where mass poverty will be vanquished. So that was the ideals on which the Indian constitution came into being 80 years ago, 70 years ago, earlier this year. And there were many, many remarkable people. I've written on Gandhi, but another great founder of the Indian Republic was the person who oversaw the drafting of the Indian Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, who was born in a Dalit or untouchable home himself, educated at Columbia and London, an extraordinary emancipator of his people and the Indian people. Jawaharlal Nehru, who was Prime Minister, who was a Hindu, but committed to equality for Muslims, who was a man, but fervently stood for gender equality. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who unified India because the British left India in a mess. They created two nations, but left behind 500 princely states, which this great administrative genius, Sardar Patel, brought in peaceably into the Indian Union. So there was an extraordinary concatenation of nation builders who united us around shared values. Now, I just say a little bit about the Indian idea of nationalism and how it differs from where you are in France. Now, you are in France, you used to be in England. And if you read the great works on British nationalism, for example, by Linda Colley, she shows in her great book, Forging the Nation, that a sense of national unity was forged in the 18th century around a shared language, English, so that Gaelic and Welsh was kind of suppressed, around a a privileged religion. So to be truly English meant to be Protestant, not Catholic. Catholic was second class, Jews were third class, and around hatred for a common enemy, namely France. You go across the border and you look at the history of French nationalism as documented by great historians, for example, like the American Eugene Weber, you see exactly the reverse. To be French meant a standardized French, so that the dialects spoken in Normandy and Brittany and so on are suppressed. It meant Catholics are first class, Protestants are second class, and it meant hatred of England. Now, the greatness of the Indian version of nationalism, that it bound people together around a set of values: democracy, pluralism, social equality, federalism, rights to the provinces, and all these are under threat today.
And these values, I mean, in some ways, like the US, it's a country built on values rather than ethnicity. But like in the US, you have a dominant ethnicity. In the US, from the start, it's white. And in India, the Hindus are the majority. And there's always a strain of Hindu nationalism saying, actually, this is a Hindu nation, we should be in control. And it's a Hindu extreme nationalist who shoots Gandhi.
Yeah, and of course, the origins, the idea that India is essentially a Hindu nation goes back to the 19th century. So the Indian National Congress, which I must hasten to tell your viewers, bears no resemblance to a body called the Indian National Congress today, which is a fake, corrupt, nepotistic body merely claiming that mantle of the freedom movement. And we can talk about that a little later and how the fake Congress has helped Narendra Modi's rise. But the Indian National Congress, which was founded in 1885, was described by one historian as a Noah's Ark of nationalism, which wanted to keep every species of Indian on board. So Bengali, Tamil, Gujarati, Hindu, Parsi, high caste, low caste, worker, peasant, artisan, everyone on board. And at the same time, there was a wave of Hindu nationalism which said we are essentially a Hindu nation. In the early 20th century, the kind of incipient definition of nationalism on the basis of religion was challenged by Muslims, who are a very large minority in the Indian subcontinent, and a competing strain of Muslim nationalism arose under the Muslim League, which was founded in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress strove for a free and united India. Tragically, they failed. India was freed but also divided. And Pakistan was constituted as a homeland for Muslims, and later, of course, it became...
Because they were both part of British India, encompassed Pakistan and India.
Yeah, and it then became a full-fledged Islamic republic. And so what the Hindu nationalists of today are saying is, if Pakistan can make religion definitive of what the state is, what the nation is, what laws are, we shall do the same here in reverse. We will become, in effect, a Hindu Pakistan. And of course, that is completely violative of the founding principles of the Republic.
But this Hindu nationalism, quite early on, it starts to organize itself. And this is where we start coming to Modi. An organization called the RSS is founded as a kind of, let's say, military wing of Hindu nationalism. How would you describe the RSS and explain its importance in the Indian story?
So military is strong, but certainly militant wing of Hindu nationalism, founded in 1925, and greatly inspired by Italy, actually. Several early leaders of the RSS traveled to Italy, met Mussolini, admired the sense of masculine domination, physical discipline, unifying around hatred of the other, in this case, of course, hatred of the Muslims. And as we move to the 30s or 40s, the Muslims also have their own kind of militant wing called the Khalsas. And Gandhi, of course, spends his last years trying to overcome armed and violent militancy on both sides and bring about peace. So after independence, the RSS, it's a former member of the RSS. In fact, there's a debate as to whether he was a former member or a still serving member of the RSS, called Nathuram Godse, who murders Gandhi for allegedly being too soft towards the Muslims. The RSS is banned, then it's unbanned, and it slowly claws its way back into political dominance. A party is formed called the Jan Sangh in the early 1950s. It is then rebranded as what is now called the Bharatiya Janata Party. And a lot of the rise of, this is again very, very important for a historian to point out and for students of India today to remember, a great deal of, how do I put it, among the important reasons for the rise of the RSS and the BJP and a kind of Hindu first, Hindu supremacist view of the world has to do with the degeneration of the Congress party through the 60s and 70s and beyond.
So just the Congress party is the historical ruling party of Gandhi, and the BJP is a Hindu nationalist party.
Correct. So the Congress, which will lead the freedom struggle, is governing India democratically from 1947 till 1977. 30 years uninterrupted. It's sort of like, since Simon, you have South African roots, and maybe there are a few people here from South Africa, think of the Indian National Congress like the African National Congress. It's now 25 years since South Africa became free and democratic. And now the ANC is losing the luster of being in the vanguard of the freedom struggle. So it took 30 years for the Congress to lose that luster and for a coherent opposition to really emerge. Opposition had emerged in different provinces, again, like the ANC in South Africa, where you have, the DA, which is powerful in the Cape and so on. In southern India, you had non-Congress parties that had come to power even in the 50s and the 60s. But it's really only from the 80s that the BJP and the RSS become more visible, more powerful, more politically prominent, win state elections to begin with in northern and western India, and then of course come to power as head of a coalition in 1997, 50 years after independence. And over the last 2.5 decades, they've really been a major force in Indian politics and public life.
So Narendra Modi, how does he fit into this story that you've been telling us?
So he joins the RSS as a young man. Again, as a historian, I'm drawn by parallels, not just with Italian fascists, but by communism. If you look at interwar Europe, and young men seeking a purpose in life join the party and devote their life to the party and learn to repeat the slogans and the catechisms of the party. So instead of capitalists are bad, Muslims are bad, and it's kind of indoctrinated in all of that. And the party cell is a site of brotherly fraternity and solidarity and masculinity. So Narendra Modi leaves home. He's born in a relatively impoverished working class kind of home. He leaves home, joins the RSS as a young man, and devotes his entire life to it. So he's in the RSS as a worker of that organization, of that militant wing of the Hindu nationalist movement. Then he's loaned to the BJP after a decade and a half in the RSS, and he works as an organizer of the BJP, as a general secretary of the party, trying to build their links and strengthen their grassroots base in different parts of India, make them more capable of fighting elections and taking on the Congress in different states. 15 years as an RSS full-timer, 15 years as an organizer, and then in 2001, he's made chief minister of his home state of Gujarat, where he's, is in that post for 13 years before he becomes prime minister. So, there are kind of 4 phases to his life, and what is important to remember from a biographer's point of view is that for more than almost 50 years, his entire commitment has been to that ideology and to that organization. It's 50 years of, and no breaks. You are like me, a columnist, you write a weekly column, but you take a lot of breaks like me. It's like 50 years of intense, committed devotion to that cause. In my view, an awful and divisive cause, but that's why he gets his motive power and his strength and his commitment, and even in some ways, his appeal among his followers. That he's totally devoted to that.
So he's a true believer, unlike Donald Trump. He cares about politics. He's devoted his life to this cause. And then he's also, he's ruthless. So when he is Prime Minister of Gujarat, the state of Gujarat.
Chief Minister of Gujarat.
Chief Minister, sorry. Yeah. Anglicism, my apologies. There are pogroms against Muslims. And this is a real black mark against him. Can you tell us what happens there?
So the background to that is that there was a movement from the 1980s to have a temple built on the site of a mosque in the northern city of Ayodhya, a mosque that was built by a general of the Emperor Babur in the 16th century, very likely on the site of a temple, and it is believed, but this of course no historian can prove, on the site of what is supposed to have been the birthplace of the mythical god King Ram. And there were people from the BJP who had gone to Ayodhya to mobilize for the destruction of the mosque. They came back. They were killed in a train accident or in a fire allegedly set on by Muslim mobs, a mob of 50 Muslims. And in retaliation, there was a pogrom against Muslims all across Gujarat. Now, this was not the first pogrom in India. 18 years before the pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat, there had been a pogrom against Sikhs in Delhi. And this was a pogrom, you could say, presided over by Rajiv Gandhi. His mother had been very similar to what happened in Gujarat. His mother had been assassinated by two of her security guards who were Sikhs, and retaliation was wreaked on ordinary Sikhs in Delhi who had nothing to do with the two assassins of Indira Gandhi, as happened in Gujarat, that those 1,000 and odd Muslims who were killed had nothing to do with those who were charged with creating a fire in the Zerbe Bogie. And Rajiv Gandhi was happy to let the fire smolder to consolidate his vote bank. That's what he did in 1984. And Narendra Modi more or less did the same thing 18 years later. And again, I don't know if this phrase is common, in the kind of circles that Pamela and you write about, talk about, a phrase called whataboutery.
Yes, whataboutism.
It's called whataboutery in India. So if you say, what about, when you raise the question of Narendra Modi and the pogrom against Muslims while he was chief minister, which he could have stopped because he had the police and the administration at his command, the supporters of the BJP will say, what about Rajiv Gandhi? So this is one of many examples, and I can enumerate others, in which the errors, the crimes, the deficiencies, the corruption of the Congress party have directly fed into the consolidation and the strengthening of the BJP and Narendra Modi. And
he stands aside during the pogroms. Many people are killed. He's actually banned from visiting the US until he becomes Prime Minister of India in, if I'm right, 2013.
2014.
2014.
2014, yeah.
So here is a man who is steeped in militant Hindu nationalism, becomes prime minister of a country founded on the ideals of multiculturalism, let's say. So how does he set about trying to turn India into a Hindu majoritarian run state?
So let's go back to 2013. A year before the general elections are due in 2014, the Congress government run by a coalition is in its second term. There's an old and weak and ineffective prime minister called Manmohan Singh, who had been a very good economist and an excellent finance minister, but was a rather incompetent prime minister. There's an anti-corruption movement against Manmohan Singh. Narendra Modi senses that there's a chance to become prime minister as the BJP's candidate. And in preparation for several years before this, he's been rebranding himself as a man of development. Or the Hindi phrase goes, Vikas Purush. So the whataboutery helps here because he's saying, okay, Rajiv Gandhi supervised over that pogrom, did nothing during his time during that pogrom. Maybe I did nothing, but then I was inexperienced. Now I've become a man of development. I'm bringing investment to Gujarat. I'm building dams. I'm promoting, a good governance. And I'm better than this old, effete, doddering prime minister. And that's how it's a rebranding of himself as a man of development and his appeal to the young, and of course his hardcore Hindu base, that allows him to achieve this very impressive victory in 2014. And the first term, the kind of supremacist edge to his faith, he keeps hidden. And he goes around the world, he meets all kinds of leaders, he goes often to China, he makes many trips to China, to Japan, to Europe, to America. And he says, I am going to carry on India's economic liberalization. And he does not make any overtly anti-Muslim statements, though his party members are. In 2015, 2016, there are lynchings, brutal lynchings of Muslims, allegedly for eating beef, which Hindus, of course, hold the cow as sacred. And in 2019, again, because of the total incompetence and nepotism of the Congress party, he is re-elected. And it's once he wins a second term that he openly, directly manifests his ideology in governance. So an early act is to abolish the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which was the only Muslim majority state in the Union, and to reduce the constitutional safeguards that the people of Kashmir had been given to rubble. Shortly after that, he promulgates a Citizenship Amendment Act, which essentially says, if interpreted fully, that Muslims will be second-class citizens. Then the Supreme Court delivers a verdict on the disputed site in Ayodhya I told you about, and he goes and presides over the ceremony of the building of a great Ram temple. And he in some ways, Simon, he has begun to see himself as an emperor-like figure, almost like the first emperor of the Hindus. Again, we need a very brief detour into medieval history here. As many of your viewers will know, through much of the medieval period, from what 1200 till the East India Company came, to 1700, much of northern India was ruled by Muslim rulers. You had the Lodhis, and then you had the Khiljis, and then of course you had the Mughals. And there's a part of Hindu myth-making, or part of Hindu history, you could say, is the rebellion against these outsiders who came from Central Asia by Hindu chieftains, such as Maharana Pratap in Rajasthan and Shivaji in Maharashtra. Now, these Hindu leaders were fighting against a foreign invader, but they never controlled more than a small fraction of Indian territory. They were never able to, really assert their supremacy in Delhi, which is the capital of India. Then the British came, and then a new set of colonizers took us over, European and white and Christian rather than Turkish and Muslim. And Narendra Modi sees himself as the first Hindu to unite India under a Hindu flag. And if you see the way he dresses, the way he behaves, the way he conducts himself, absolutely imperious fashion. In the midst of this pandemic, he's now redesigning Delhi to build a new grand capital with a new house for himself. He never gives press conferences because he's an emperor, not a prime minister. In 6 years, he's not talked to the press. So that's how he's begun to see himself. Now, one last thing I must say, emphasize before I finish my answer to you. The real Narendra Modi has departed from the RSS BJP view of Hindu nationalism in one way. The cult of personality. The RSS did not believe in a cult of personality. They openly mocked it. They called it Vyakti Puja or individual worship. They believed in collective solidarity. Narendra Modi is akin to communist leaders like Mao and Stalin in his use of the state propaganda and state apparatus to build a cult of personality around himself. And the RSS has succumbed because they see Modi's enormous popularity and drive and brutal efficiency in suppressing dissent as a vehicle to constructing their Hindu theocratic state. So there's an extraordinary cult of personality around Modi, which is unequaled in the history of democracies. It's only have been equaled in totalitarian regimes like North Korea, China, and Russia, and Soviet Russia.
Well, there is, of course, something familiar about this, the attack on an established democracy by somebody who is not entirely in accordance with democracy. And Trump did a version of that. And when we spoke in London just before the pandemic, you were saying, well, Modi is tougher than Trump, he's more serious than Trump, and India's institutions are weaker than the US's. So you were worried about the future of Indian democracy under this assault. So what has Modi done to try and subvert Indian democracy, if that's what he's doing? And how successful has it been?
Yeah, so there's several aspects to that subversion. Let me try and unpack them one by one. The first is the muzzling of the press. Partly through intimidation and harassment of independent journalists, many of whom are in jail, false cases foisted against others, and partly to funding or indirectly supporting right-wing propaganda channels. Our right-wing propaganda channels make Fox News a beacon of sobriety and humility and tolerance. That's in fact, they've been compared by one senior journalist to North Korean propaganda channels. So the press has been suborned to the purposes of the state and the great leader. The judiciary is infirm and scared. It has become a captive and administrative judiciary. It's not like, what's happened in America today, where the Supreme Court and the other courts, even when packed with allegedly Republican nominees, has completely stood out for judicial independence. So the judiciary has collapsed. I have called it in an essay a collaborationist judiciary. It's collaborationist in the construction of an authoritarian state around the cult of a personality. So the press, the judiciary, civil services, of course, Indira Gandhi, who was also had dictatorial tendencies and imposed a reign of emergency for 2 years, also used the civil service, the tax authorities, and the police to harass her opponents. Modi has done that. In one column, I called Narendra Modi Indira Gandhi on steroids because he's used her methods much more brutally and efficiently. She also suppressed the press. She also suborned the judiciary. And two other things. For the first time in our history as an independent nation, even the armed forces have come under Modi's sway. He promoted a general out of turn who was loyal not just to him, but to his ideology. And the great difference between India and Pakistan and India and any number of Asian or African countries was that our armed forces were proudly non-political and proudly non-sectarian. So a Hindu majoritarian authoritarian inflection has entered the armed forces, not without resistance. There are many senior generals who are not happy privately with what the Chief of Army Staff promoted by Modi has done. And last of all, the destruction of or the steady erosion of Indian federalism. We are like the US, a union of states. And many states are controlled by opposition parties. And the constitution has a clear division of powers, where things like education, health, law and order are under the control of the states. But he has used the pandemic and a 19th century colonial act invoked in times of plague and his control over the press, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy to eviscerate Indian federalism and centralize everything in Delhi. So these are the ways in which, multiple ways in which Modi, and aided by his Home Minister Amit Shah, who's really his right-hand man, have undermined our institutions and imperiled Indian democracy.
Now, we have a question from Niranjan Gokhale, which is somewhat on those lines. He asks, what is the historical dream of the Hindu right that is being pursued here? Is it about a socio-cultural, Hindu India, or what, do they have a legal and constitutional strategy? What is Modi going to do next? What is the game plan?
So I can't say, I always say I'm a historian who uses the past to illuminate the present. I don't look into the future, even though it's a far more profitable profession being an astrologer than a historian in most parts of the world. So I can't say what he'll do next. But if you look at Hindu nationalist ideology, the Hindu nationalists, the RS and the BJP came that they're the true patriots and people like me are anti-nationals, right? But what does that patriotism composed of? There's nothing Indian about their worldview. It's one part Italian fascism, as I've explained, and it's one part medieval Islamic political theology. In the medieval Islamic states of the Middle East, Muslims were first-class citizens, Jews and Christians were second-class citizens. People of the book were not persecuted. They could practice their professions, raise their families, so long as they did not express their views independently, so long as they did not claim any offices, in the universities, in the law courts, in the army, as advisors to the king. So there was, the category was known as dhimmi, as you will know. So the essential political theology of the RSS is make Muslims and Christians second-class citizens. And that's what they're doing by their changes. For example, and the Supreme Court is totally complicit in it. That's the area where it is collaborating. There have been some awful acts explicitly discriminatory against Muslims, including one which wants to forbid intermarriage between Hindus and Muslims, including the Citizenship Amendment Act, which are clearly violative of the spirit and the letter of the Indian Constitution. But although petitions have been filed 18 months ago, the Supreme Court still won't hear them. On the other hand, a bail petition of a journalist close to the regime, a kind of, Fox, the leading anchor of our Fox News, that bail petition is heard within hours by the Supreme Court. So if the court is being used to undermine the constitution, undermine the principle of equal access to justice, and facilitate the construction of a Hindu theocratic state.
We have two interesting questions from Kirsty Shroff, which is, what is the size of Modi's Hindu base? So who are the people behind him? And also, is the Indian intelligentsia part of this base? Where is the intelligentsia on this?
Yeah, so the first question, like, I don't know where Percy Shroff is based or where he's from, but we follow the Westminster model of elections. So first past the post. We have 500 odd parliamentary constituencies. In each constituency, there's a separate election. It's not presidential like the French or the American. It's not proportional representation like many countries in Europe. So the BJP, in its two electoral victories, has got between 30 and 40% of the popular vote. But that's been enough to get it a majority in parliament because of the discrepancies of the first past the post system. But it's a very large constituency, and there's a cult around Modi. So even people who don't vote for the BJP think that Modi is our savior. He stand up against Pakistan, he'll stand up against China, he's a strong man, he's not self-made, he does not partake in the dynastic culture of other parties. And of course, for the hardcore, he will properly beat up on Muslims. That's also part of his appeal, right? So he is popular. His party commands between 30 and 40% of the electoral base. They've also manipulated the electoral system. So they make electoral funding secretive rather than transparent. And they use intimidation to get the top corporates to give them more money than to the other parties. This has been well documented. Those of you who are interested, do go to the website of an excellent organization called Association for Democratic Reforms, or read a book called When Crime Pays, which shows the distortions in the electoral system and how the BJP has manipulated even the democratic process. So that's
briefly, they intervene in the British and American election systems as well. They have favored candidates in those countries, the BJP.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Modi wanted very keen to get Trump to win, and fortunately he failed. Fortunately for the world, not just for India, Modi could not get his friend Donald Trump elected president. Now, the intelligentsia, that's a complex question. Like the Italian fascists, the RSS is a profoundly anti-intellectual organization. They've been 6 years in power, but they haven't nurtured the universities. They talk about the glories of Indian culture, but they don't have a clue as to how to promote high-quality Sanskrit learning, how to revive our systems of classical music, classical art. They are an utterly Philistine lot. If you were to, by any objective criteria, if you were to try and compile a list of the 100 top Indian social scientists, economists, sociologists, historians, constitutional experts, with great difficulty, you'll get 5 out of those 100 who are sympathetic to the BJP, because they are an anti-intellectual lot. Like the Italian fascists were.
We have an interesting question from Kay about caste. What is the place of caste in BJP politics?
Yeah, this is a very important,
still as important as it always used to be in India.
This is a very important question, and thank you for asking it. Because the BJP started as a party whose solid vote bank comprised Brahmins, who are the topmost caste, traditionally the scholars and the priests and the intellectuals, and the merchants or baniyas, who are the third caste. But it has greatly expanded towards the fourth caste, the Shudra, the fourth order, the Shudras, who are workers and peasants, and even the erstwhile untouchables known as the Dalits. And this is a very important and dangerous aspect of their growth, which is often ignored by left-wing Indian commentators, who still dismiss them as a Brahmin, Banya, or upper caste party. They have brought low caste and tribals into their tent by saying, even we'll make you better off than the Muslims. At least you'll be better off than the Muslims. So that is the kind of seductive hope, seductive and really, in the long run, destructive possibility held out to lower castes. And so that, you have Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs are about little less than 20% of India's population. So if you concentrate on the 80% and all castes within them, Modi himself is from a backward caste. He's unlike earlier leaders of the BJP who were upper caste and Brahmin. He's not from an upper caste. That's part of his appeal. Uh, you can win a plurality of the votes. And they, among the 300 odd MPs in parliament, there's not a single Muslim. They do not choose Muslim candidates because they don't even need to show token sympathy for Muslims. Right? That's their electoral strategy. It's utterly and totally majoritarian. And among their great achievements, so to say, political achievements, electoral achievements of the last 20 years is to bring low caste who are suspicious of their upper caste ideology leadership into the tent by demonizing the other being Muslims.
I hate to be Western centric about this, but so much resonates with what we've seen in the United States drama of recent months. So Trump also said to lower caste whites, at least you'll be better off than black people. And there had been no pretense at bringing in African Americans into senior roles in the Republican Party. There is a use of a racial group to scapegoat by Trump. You've obviously watched the US intensely too. What kind of differences and similarities do you see in the Trump and Modi voter bases?
So, I think in the case of the US, the external enemy is very far away. Even if you try and mobilize people against China or against foreigners in general, it's rather distant. Here, the external enemy is Pakistan. So the burden of history plays on our minds every single day. It is Pakistan that divided the motherland. It is Pakistan that fostered 3 wars against us. It is Pakistan that promotes terrorism in Kashmir and elsewhere. And always the hatred of, and Pakistan has done all of these things. I mean, Pakistan is the world's greatest exporter of terrorism. Pakistani deep state, not Pakistani people. The Pakistani deep state or the Pakistani state is the world's greatest exporter of terrorism, also the world's greatest exporter of nuclear proliferation. I mean, Iran and North Korea would not have, bombs without the help of Pakistan. So people like Modi have this, in some ways, this diabolical advantage over Trump that the enemy is a real enemy across the border, and to stoke paranoia and insecurity among their voter base. So the last election of 2019, there was a terror attack from Pakistan just a few months before. And if that terror attack had not happened, Modi may not have won such a large majority, because once the terror attack happened, Hindus trusted Modi to stand up against Pakistan rather than the effete, incompetent, lazy, 5th generation dynast who leads the Congress party, Rahul Gandhi. So that's one difference, that we have a real enemy and he's next door. And you can always stoke the awful things he's either done or is set to be planning soon. Right. Now, the other major difference is what we spoke about already, the weakness of independent institutions in India. And the third difference is the degraded state of the Congress party. Once the Democrats decided upon Joe Biden, and he could be portrayed plausibly as a safe pair of hands, not a crazy lunatic, as someone who had empathy, care, understanding, and administrative experience, they could win elections. In a country which you know so well, England, as soon as Corbyn was sacked and a new leader of the Labour Party was elected, a more credible and capable leader was elected, you could see that Boris Johnson became more vulnerable, his position became more insecure. Modi is enormously helped by Rahul Gandhi and the Gandhi family. In a column I wrote a few days ago, I essentially called them facilitators of Modi, and that's what really they are. And if they lead, for example, if the Gandhis were to exit Indian politics, which they won't because they control the money, they like the attention, they don't know where to go, they think that they have a divine right to rule India, but if they were to go, there'll be a vacuum. And Modi's extraordinary incompetence at administration will be exposed. Though he's a master at winning elections, he's a master at demonizing his enemy, he's a master at using state propaganda, he's disastrous when it comes to running the economy. And now there's a growing farmers' protest, there's joblessness, there's insecurity among people all across India with his divisive politics. and a real opposition can grow. But so long, Modi's greatest advantage, so he has three great advantages over Trump. One, a real enemy next door, fragile and weak institutions that can't check him, and an absolutely worthless and toothless opposition.
We have many good questions coming in. I'm going to try to get as many of them as possible. We have one from Aman Mathur, which links to what you were just saying about lack of opposition. He says, look, historically in India, authoritarian governments have been voted out. And I've heard you saying India is a 60% democracy. It has flaws as a democracy, but it's still pretty much a democracy. So won't Indian voters take it upon themselves next time to vote Modi out? Or is the BJP too clever and too rooted for that to happen?
It's clever, rooted, ruthless. It has much more money. It has control over institutions. And again, the last time we were in a similar situation was in the 1970s when we had a putative dictator who became an actual dictator, Indira Gandhi. And leading the opposition to Indira Gandhi was a man called Jayaprakash Narayan, someone who had been a great Indian patriot, a great hero of the 1942 Quit India movement, an extraordinarily well-traveled man, widely respected, done very good social work. And he was kind of a saintly alternative to Indira Gandhi. And in India, probably like Britain too, prime minister general elections are becoming increasingly presidential. It's about who you put forward as your prime ministerial candidate. And I can't say what will happen. There are more than 3 years to the next election, and Modi is not immortal. I mean, no emperor has ever been immortal, right? So in that there is some hope, but at the moment the situation is very bleak. And given where we are today, given the state of the Congress party, it's going to get even bleaker.
What you see in these very polarized countries is regions that are not represented in power, they get tempted to secede. So we have Scotland and possibly Northern Ireland in Britain. We have the southern states in the US, which are going to be very unhappy under a democratic presidency. What about in India, where Priya Licht points out South India, West Bengal are not on Modi's hand, and Kay adds, she's talking about Tamil Nadu and Kerala in the south. So what are these regions going to do? These are not BJP supporting places.
Well, you see, there's a divide between South India and North India. Now, again, there's someone waiting in the wings to succeed Modi as the prime ministerial face of the BJP. And he's even more dangerous and divisive. He's a man called Adityanath, who has a chief minister of the largest Indian state, Uttar Pradesh, who is very thuggish in his behavior, completely bigoted in his ideology. But the BJP's foot soldiers love him because he's even more hardline than Modi. He says even more nasty things about Muslims than Modi. And of course, he's not popular in the South. Modi became popular in sections of the South because he was able to represent himself as a man of development. There's a serious North-South divide emerging and has been emerging in the last 10, 15 years. The South is more outward looking, more progressive, more innovative. It has better universities. It has more robust rates of economic growth. Public services don't work so badly in the South. There's less communal violence. Women feel safer. There are more women entrepreneurs. Now, would this lead to, I think it'd be very hard for the South to secede because you need an army and all of that. But the South will at some stage be fed up of subsidizing the North through resource transfers. And if this continues, particularly if this man Adityanath was to succeed Modi, the South will clearly see the writing on the wall. Their prospects for steady, sustained economic development are being undermined by the awful bigotry in North India.
We're coming to the last couple of questions. Sahal Merchant asks, is the West also complicit in the rise of Modi, especially with his pro-business, pro-capitalist stance? And my follow-up would be, what stance should Western democracies post-Trump now take towards the India of Modi?
It's not for me to advise what Western democracies do. I mean, I'm an Indian. I live and work in India. I write in India. I'm worried about my country. Your countries have your own problems. So I really am not. I mean, you should be aware of it. You should be aware of what's happening. I think there's a growing awareness. There's some outstanding reportage by Western journalists in India. And during Indira Gandhi's emergency, all good Western journalists were asked to leave the country. Similar kind of thing could happen. I mean, the completely truthful and accurate reports carried, for example, in the Financial Times and the Economist and the Wall Street and the Washington Post and the New York Times, and even on occasion the Wall Street Journal about India are very telling and much more truthful than carried in large sections of the Indian press. So they should be open, they should be aware. But ultimately, we have to help ourselves. We are, if we are worthy of the freedom movement, of Gandhi, of Ambedkar, of 70 years of pluralism, we have to take responsibility and recover what remains of the republic from the ravages of this supremacist, authoritarian, and absolutely awful regime.
My last question, if Gandhi were to see all this, he wouldn't be altogether surprised, would he?
All I'll say about Gandhi is that Gandhi belongs to the world. He does not belong to India. A large part of what is happening in India today is a repudiation of Gandhi's vision. But in this, Indians have been there before. The Buddha found enlightenment on Indian soil, and we kicked him out because he was too enlightened for us. We didn't like his message of equality and harmony. And we may do the same thing to Gandhi. And the rest of you will uphold and affirm him, and that's good for you. So it's not so much Gandhi so much as, essentially, Simon, if you go back 15 years, India was a beacon of hope. When I first published the first edition of my book, India After Gandhi, which is 13 years ago, India was growing steadily economically. It looked like we were going to conquer mass poverty. It looked like this unnatural nation had built a democratic political system and a pluralistic social order, despite all the odds. Unlike China, we were not authoritarian. We were open, we were outward, and we were economically growing and conquering mass poverty. And we've blown all that away. So Indians should be aware of what we've lost in the last 10 or 15 years. It goes back to the second term of Manmohan Singh, where the rot really began to set in. It's intensified and accelerated in the 2 terms of Modi. But Indians will remember the hope and the idealism and the admiration that we had and the admiration that the rest of the world had for us not so long ago, and how our leaders have blown it, and how, if we do not recognize the dangers of fusing faith and state, furthering a cult of personality, undermining independent institutions, curbing a free press, what that will do not just to our democratic future, but to our human future, to our economic future, Indians must recognize this.